This is the America's Quarterly Podcast. I'm Brian Winter. All eyes are on Claudia Sheinbaum after her unexpectedly large 30-point victory in Mexico's presidential election. What can we expect from Sheinbaum and her relationship with her popular predecessor, Andrés Manuel López Obrador?
He has been the glue of the party, and the capacity of López Obrador to keep the party together, to resolve conflict, to talk to different actors within Mexican politics is going to be pure gold for somebody like Sheinbaum. I don't think that he's going to conduct the country. I just think that's pure sexist analysis. But he's definitely going to be part of the fauna of Mexican politics.
Everyone I know expected Claudia Sheinbaum to be elected Mexico's president last Sunday. No one I know expected her to win by 30 points, handing her a mandate like few others in Latin America's recent political history. Sheinbaum's party, Morena, came very close to a so-called supermajority in both chambers of Congress, which would let it make sweeping changes to the Mexican Constitution and institutional landscape. So the question everybody has now, from media to observers of democracy to investors, is what will Sheinbaum and Morena do with all that power? Will they try to remove some of the remaining checks and balances in Mexico's young democracy? Will they attempt to overhaul the economy, raise taxes, and increase the size of the Mexican state in an effort to address inequality? To what extent will Sheinbaum's 6-year term be a continuation of her predecessor, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, or AMLO, who oversaw, among other things, a doubling of Mexico's minimum wage, as well as a decline in poverty? I will tell you that I had hypotheses on all of these questions going into the election, but I feel like the magnitude of the victory is forcing all of us to re-examine how Mexico got here and what comes next. Our guest is Viri Ríos, an academic and writer who has written extensively about AMLO, Sheinbaum, and Morena. Her latest book is No es normal. The subtitle and an English translation is The Rigged Game That Fuels Mexican Inequality and How to Change It. Viri just wrote a piece for America's Quarterly entitled How Claudia Sheinbaum Will Be Different from AMLO. You can find that on this show's notes on our website. Viri, welcome to the AQ Podcast.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Viri, I spoke in the introduction about the overwhelming nature of not only Claudia Sheinbaum's victory, but that of her party, Morena. What, in your view, was the message from the Mexican electorate in this vote?
Let me take one step back and try to describe to you what I think are the 3 reasons why Claudia won, right? And I think the first one and most important is what is happening on the labor market. AMLO doubled the minimum wage. He tripled the minimum wage in the border. He also approved several reforms that improve the quality of jobs all around Mexico, to the point that from 2018 to 2024, the average labor income in Mexico increased 24% above inflation, right? So people regularly vote with their pockets in Mexico everywhere. And what we observed, is basically Mexicans voting for a government that improve their quality of life. So that's the first and most important reason. A second reason doesn't really have to be with Sheinbaum. I think it has to do more with her opposition. And the problem was that her opposition was truly incompetent. They formed a coalition that was an ideological Frankenstein. It was basically every single party on the ideological spectrum, a left party, a center party, a conservative party, all together in a single agenda, the agenda of being anti-President López Obrador, anti-incumbent. However, that agenda is kind of not attractive in Mexico, right? Like President López Obrador is extremely popular. And therefore, this idea that we should unite against López Obrador, an evil president, a president that is destroying democracy, is kind of like something that really didn't land it, right? Like just people didn't believe that, right? Actually, when you look at the numbers of Latino Barometro, what we observed is the opposite. People believe that democracy is working better. They believe more in the government. They believe more in political parties. That's shocking for Latin America. Like we had never seen something like this in Mexico, just suddenly political parties becoming popular. So, I think overall, it was a very bad strategy. And then finally, I would say that a third reason would be just, I call it luck, right? Like Mexico is a very good moment right now, right? Or at least there is the expectation that this is going to be a very good moment for Mexico because of nearshoring. And even if investment hasn't come as much as it could, it has come more. Like foreign direct investment is at its highest right now. Confidence from consumers is also historically high. Remittances, which is a very important source of income for low-income families, has also increased dramatically from 2018 to 2023. It has increased in 42% above inflation, right? So that's it's dramatic. So this is like flows and flows of money that are going again into the pockets of the working class.
Everyone I know, Viri, expected Claudia Sheinbaum to win. No one I know expected a victory of this magnitude. And I described the numbers in the introduction. As someone who follows Latin America as a whole, I have struggled to think of too many other recent examples in which one party or one leader acquired this much power through the ballot box. Examples that come to mind include Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, Rafael Correa kind of at his peak in Ecuador, perhaps Evo Morales at the peak of his popularity in Bolivia. But, there was nothing like this when Lula, for example, was at his peak. And I've always seen a lot of similarities between AMLO and Lula. I mean, both generational talents who achieved a level of power with the working class that their predecessors had not been able to do. But Brazil, very fragmented, never had Lula, even at his peak, the PT never had this kind of control over Congress. My question for you is, even as someone who, understands the accomplishments of Morena over the last 6 years, do you worry that this is too much power?
I think to understand what happened, we need to go a little bit back in history and understand too that, Mexico transitioned to democracy with the expectation that the turnover of political power would improve life of the majorities. And this just didn't happen, right? So governments after the transition were great creating electoral institutions. Mexico has very sound electoral institutions, but they were a total, absolute failure promoting economic inclusion. In the first administrations after democratic transition, so that's from 2000 to 2018, before AMLO took power, the top 1% of the richest Mexicans went from holding 12% of the national income to holding 30%, right? That's the largest increase of income inequality among 181 countries. That's literally the largest increase of inequality in the world, according to the World Inequality Database, right? So it's only natural that in a country like that, there was a demand for populism, right? And there was a rejection of what democracy had meant, right? Now, as we were discussing before, with AMLO, satisfaction with democracy increased, confidence in representative democracy, actually, that's very important. Confidence in representative democracy also increased, right? But And now this is a result of that. This is just like it's a natural result. I do think this is a lot of power, right? But having power is not a problem in democracy. The problem is, what do you do with that power, right? And I think we need to stop being scared of having powerful politicians, because we need powerful politicians to advance agendas.
So, Viri, I have so many other things I want to ask you about, including your knowledge of Claudia Sheinbaum herself, having followed her career over the years. But I do want to ask you one more question about the state of Mexican democracy and Mexican institutions, because as you know, and our audience knows, the debate about that dominated a lot of the run up to the election itself. And, some of these issues are very specific. I mean, AMLO's desire to directly elect Supreme Court judges, the weakening of the electoral regulators and other autonomous agencies that can serve as a check on power, the way he has treated not only members of the opposition, but members of the press. For example, doxing the Mexico bureau chief of the New York Times after that newspaper ran a story that was critical. The involvement of military in key aspects of the economy. Just briefly, I mean, how worried should we be about the strength of Mexican democracy, both today and going forward over the next, say, 3 years, given the makeup of institutions following this electoral result on Sunday?
Okay, so this is a very difficult question to answer, right? So let me just caveat this, because I'm going to be here in history predicting the future, right? I believe we have to trust politicians, right? I believe we have to at least take seriously what they say on their campaigns. And if we listen to what Claudia said in her campaign, we're listening to somebody that is basically saying that there are going to be important reforms in Mexico. And she is saying that she's going to reform the judicial system. She is saying that she's going to reform the electoral system. We still don't know how much or when, but I do think we need to be ready for that to happen. Now, even over the course of López Obrador terms, he has proposed, as you know, different kinds of electoral reforms. I think the first kind of electoral reform that he proposed was pretty good. And then, as time passes, the electoral reforms that he started proposing are kind of like more and more radical, right? Including at the end, just the absolute disappearance of proportional representation, right? So we don't know where Claudia is going to land in that spectrum. I think because of what we observed in her team and in her own narrative, I think she's going to land more like at the beginning, right? So I think we are going to have an electoral reform and a judicial reform that is going to have good features. I feel that constantly the American press is covering Mexico as in a perpetual moment of alarm, right? Like whatever Sheinbaum proposes, it must be evil, right? Like otherwise it wouldn't just happen, And I don't think that's the case. I think we need to be mature, be professional, read exactly what she's proposing. And, take the good and take the bad and understand that, yes, Mexico is going to reform itself because there is a huge popular mandate.
Why do you think that is?
I think it's because of the bias of who Washington listens to. And my favorite data point is if you look at the votes of Mexicans abroad, right? In most cities, Claudia Sheinbaum won. In most cities, right? Like it's just, in some cities, it's impressive the share of votes that she got from Mexicans living abroad. Except in a few cities, including Washington, where Xochitl won, right? So I feel that the constituency that gets listened in Washington is particularly biased. And this is important to remember because increasingly more and more, the vote of Morena comes from the working classes because of the several things we discussed at the beginning of this podcast. And the working classes and their voices are not represented in Washington. They are not listened to in this podcast or in the big, most powerful arenas of America.
Tell me what differences you see between Claudia Sheinbaum and Andrés Manuel López Obrador. You have written in various outlets that you do not think that she will be a puppet. Why is that the case?
Several things, right? But let me start by adding a few things to the critical question about Mexican democracy, right? And let me tell you a little bit about why I feel optimistic, right? Like I cannot say, that terrible things are not going to happen. It could happen, right? But I feel optimistic because to one degree or another, Mexico has many features regularly associated with democratic resilience. For example, we are mostly an urban country. We have democratic neighbors. We have certain level of economic development. There are courts that are able, so far, there are courts that are able to check on the executive power. We have a very robust competition among parties. Like, it is true that Claudia won in a landslide, but the opposition is there, is protesting, is resounding in like the international arena. I think competition is still there. Another thing that makes me optimistic is the specific personality of Claudia and the specific features that she's gonna face while being president, right? There may be some potential instability on the legislative coalition of Morena. Sheinbaum's capacity to control Morena is also not going to match AMLO's, because AMLO, was the glue, right, that held the party together.
So I asked you about Claudia, and you told me about the politics and the policy, which is great. That's important. Tell me about the person. Tell me about your impressions of her.
So the first thing to say about her is that she doesn't have the charming personality of a populist, right? If anything, I would say that she resembles more of like a technocrat, right? She used to be a full-time energy engineer professor. She's also not as popular as López Obrador. You need to be popular to dismantle democracy. That's kind of like the first thing you need to do. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. When López Obrador started his term, he had a 79% approval. That's historical. Nobody ever had something like that. And Claudia, with the numbers we have so far, is going to start around 67, which is below Fox and below AMLO, right? So she's, kind of like an average politician. She has shown more interest in at least showing that she's plural, showing that she's going to work with the opposition. In her victory speech, she declared that she wanted to rule for everybody. So I feel that in general, we're observing a very different form of leader.
We'll be back after a short break.
What does AI's tectonic change mean for Latin America? Are youth losing faith in democracy? Can the region power up its lithium prospects? Latin America in Focus, a podcast of the America Society and Council of the Americas, takes on topics like these, giving context to the big issues affecting the region today. Subscribe to Latin America in Focus wherever you get your podcasts.
She takes office in a context that is helpful, good in some ways, conducive to popularity, as you pointed out, a Mexican economy that is getting a lot of attention for nearshoring, although the results have not been overwhelming yet. But she's also got an interesting fiscal problem on her hands. López Obrador was quite responsible, some say too responsible, with fiscal management during his first 5 years in office, but then ran up a deficit in 2024 that's estimated to reach about 6% of GDP. That's the highest in Mexico since the 1980s, although below many countries. The bottom line is that she will certainly need to make some cuts and make some sacrifices during her initial months. Do you see that as taking a toll on her popularity? Or do you think that maybe given the mandate that she just got, she might say, well, you know what? I've been asked to essentially build out the Mexican state, and we'll worry about the fiscal deficit part of that later?
Okay, so you're talking to somebody that has a bias, and let me tell you why. Because I study Mexican inequality, and I truly believe, as an academic and as an expert in social policy, I truly believe that Mexico is never going to become um, sufficiently fair unless it conducts a very important fiscal reform, right? Because currently taxation is not progressive enough, and currently Mexico does just don't have enough money.
Well, and you're talking to someone who knows that in GDP terms, the Mexican state is quite small compared to other countries in Latin America, including Brazil, Argentina, and so on.
I mean, I call Mexico kind of like a secret fiscal paradise because Mexico collects less taxes as a point of GDP than the Bahamas, right? So that's the extent of the problem. Sheinbaum is saying that that she can improve that collection of taxes by digitalizing many of the process and therefore closing loops that are currently creating evasion or illusion from like big companies and individuals. I think there is definitely that happening. However, I don't know how far she can get on that, right? And what we observe with AMLO is that when he didn't reform, he didn't conduct a fiscal reform, and he didn't get that far. AMLO, last time that I checked, which was in 2022, he had increased, I think, 2 points of GDP. So, it's dramatic. The difference is basically AMLO did like half of what Peña Nieto did. So let's say that Claudia does, as AMLO, she's going to get 2 more points. And that's just not enough, right? So I do think she needs to conduct a fiscal reform. Now,
does she think she needs to conduct a fiscal reform?
No, I don't think so. I think she thinks that with like digitalization of the processes is going to be enough for her to get enough money.
Because she has that same austere grounding that AMLO does. For better and for worse. I mean, you may not agree with it. My question is it your analysis that she thinks, nope, you know what, we've got to make do more or less with what we've got?
Yes, and I think this has to do a lot with what the markets, the globalized economy demands of a country like Mexico. The moment AMLO started increasing slightly, very slightly, the expenditure, which was at the end of his term, the American press and an analyst around the world start like going wild, like if Mexico was just like, in Mexico we say throwing the house through the window when you overspend, right? So like if AMLO was throwing the house out of the window, and it's just like how is that happening? Like Mexico has a very low expenditure. We have a very low debt in terms of points of GDP for a country the size of Mexico. But the bad press, when a government, particularly a left-leaning government, starts doing this, is overwhelming, right? So Sheinbaum and AMLO, that they are smart politicians, they know that they are constrained by the expectations of investors, basically. And I think they need to implement an austere state because otherwise the market will go wild. And that's so unfair, right? Because Mexico needs to spend more. The discussion shouldn't be about whether Mexico is going to increase debt. The discussion should be about when and how to do it, because the country needs more money and it needs to develop. Also, it needs to develop in order to tackle important, international events such as immigration flows.
So, question now, asking about AMLO. Is he just going to disappear to his ranch in Tabasco like he says? What do you expect him to do?
I mean, I think let's just assume that, as I said before, we need to take politicians seriously. So let's just assume he does. I think the moment he does, Sheinbaum is going to bring him back, right? Because as we said, he has been the glue of the party, and the capacity of López Obrador to keep the party together, to resolve conflict, to talk to different actors within Mexican politics is going to be pure gold for somebody like Sheinbaum. I don't think that he's going to conduct the country. I just think that's pure sexist analysis. But he's definitely going to be part of the fauna of Mexican politics.
How do you expect her to handle Mexico's relationship with the United States?
I think she's going to be very competent. I actually, when we observe Sheinbaum in interviews, Mexicans get shocked, right? Like, because we're not used to observing and listening to politicians that are this competent. She's very smart. She answers very quickly. She speaks very good English. She's just like, she's like a PhD on engineer. I do think she's going to have a much better relationship with the US in the sense that she's going to be capable of solving. I think many of the incentives are aligned for both countries in terms of trade and most recently also in terms of immigration, because Mexico is increasingly having more and more immigrant flows and people that is staying within Mexico. So while Mexico was before just an expulsion country, now it's also becoming a country that is getting the immigrants itself, right? So I think that aligns more the incentives for both countries, Mexico and the US, to contain immigration in the southern border of Mexico.
As we wrap up here, Viri, what aspects of her administration will you be paying the most attention to in the next few months?
Okay, so that's a very good question. I would say definitely the cabinet, right? So who is in charge, who remains. I think that there are some quite competent profiles on the cabinet of AMLO, so we hope they stay. For example, in the Minister of the Exterior, Bárcena, I think she's a very good profile, so I think she's going to stay. Probably Ebrard is going to also be part of it, and Ebrard is a competent politician and a good public servant. So I think that's let's pay attention to that. A second thing was definitely Congress, right? Currently, she's going to have a supermajority in Congress, but not in the Senate. So I think we should pay attention to who commands the Senate on the side of Morena, because they are going to need a negotiator there. And then finally, I think we need to observe local politics. So many of the governors of Morena don't come from Morena. They come from other parties, particularly PRI and PAN, right? So I think that at the local level, even if at the federal level, it feels like Morena is not negotiating with anybody of the opposition, at the local level, they are. And very, very strongly, to the point that some of the Morena bases are kind of like angry about it, right? So observing Morena negotiate at the local level, I think is also going to give us kind of like a very good sense of where the party is going, really, and what's the character that the party is taking under the leadership of Sheinbaum.
Viri, thank you so much for joining us on the America's Quarterly Podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The America's Quarterly Podcast is produced and edited by Luisa Franco. Our sound engineer is Gabriela Baez.